thank you very much to the organisers of the conference for the invitation to present a paper here. It's a pleasure to be in Sheffield for the very first time, and thanks also, Danny, for that generous introduction. So this afternoon what I want to do is present an overview of how a study of conscription in the Spanish Civil War provides important insights into the factors that allowed the Nationalist Army's victory over the Republican Popular Army in the Spanish Civil War. While to date the Civil War has been analysed largely from political, economic and cultural approaches, the influence of the war on millions of ordinary Spaniards is only relatively recently receiving the same kind of attention from historians. And my primary objective for today is to suggest a different way of conceptualising the Spanish Civil War. I'll firstly speak about the case for studying conscription in the Spanish Civil War. Secondly, I want to talk about similarities between the two conscript armies and touch upon important differences. And then finally, I want to suggest how a study of conscripts can influence our understanding of the course of the actual Civil War. So a study of conscription in the Spanish Civil War, I think, does three main things. First of all, it provides important insight into the successes and limitations of the war effort on the two sides. It emphasises the two sides' management of their conscript forces and the contribution that made to the nationalist victory. And finally, it acknowledges the agency of ordinary Spaniards when faced with the eruption of the cataclysmic event that was the Civil War in their lives. Now, at the very simplest level, a history of conscription involves the study of obtaining armed men for the front lines. But many of the questions that it raises gets us to the heart of what the Civil War was about, and it involves central issues such as the extent of support for the two sides mobilising techniques, and also the way that they engaged in state or regime building during the actual war. And today I'll talk about conscripts in the central zone of the conflict, largely comprised of the two Castiles. I won't be considering conscript recruitment in the Basque Country or Catalonia on the Republican side, or for example Galicia and Navarre on the nationalist, because this introduces too many regional variations to allow for in 20 minutes. And neither will I be talking about the logistics of conscription or the social makeup of conscript, although of course I'm happy to go into that in the questions if anyone is interested. So the Spanish Civil War was a confrontation between dominant ideologies that clashed to impose their version of Spanish identity on the country and the right to shape its future. The conflict has often been interpreted as a number of interlaced struggles that divided Spain. It was a conflict between centrists and regionalists. It was a conflict between traditionalists and reformers, between Catholics and secularizers, as well as different classes. These traditional political interpretations of the conflict are certainly valid and helpful prisms to examine the war, but their centrality in the historiography has helped sideline the experience of Spaniards who weren't prepared to fight for either side until actually called up for service. The Civil War, I argue, therefore, was also a conflict in which millions of Spanish men who'd never volunteered and who didn't want to be involved fought each other for 3 years. And in this sense, my research on conscripts is a de-ideologized look at the Spanish Civil War. And I should take a moment to explain what I mean by de-ideologized. By that I mean an analysis of people who didn't, or principally men, who didn't volunteer to fight and kill for their political views after the uprising in Spain in July 1936. These people were of course not necessarily apolitical, but they were unwilling to join the conflict as volunteers, and only took part once they were conscripted by one of the two sides. However, it's worth mentioning that some of these people were genuinely apolitical, and Michael Seidman reminds us that over 80% of wage earners joined parties or unions only after the uprising in order to keep jobs or other benefits. So, as you can see from the figures, fewer than 1 in 10 combatants were volunteers. This percentage often clashes with contemporary and subsequent interpretations of the Civil War, particularly on the Republican side, because the availability of volunteers was often linked to a sense of legitimacy and popular support. Here and in the US, the participation of volunteer combatants in the international brigades, as well as the writings of George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway and others, films like Ken Loach's Land and Freedom, have also helped maintain this militia-centric perception of the Spanish Civil War. But in reality, images such as the one you now see are unrepresentative of the overall makeup of Civil War combatants. And in fact, they're probably better characterized by this image of a Republican recruitment center. So I now want to talk about the similar challenges that the two armies faced with their conscription. Although both sides, of course, pursued very different ideological objectives, they were more similar than they superficially appear, and in particular both shared the challenge of arming, motivating, and cajoling often reluctant men to fight in this war. As we've seen, after the military uprising in July 1936, only a small minority of militants internalised one or other competing ideologies and of the multiple competing ideologies, and were prepared to fight and kill to force their views on the other Spain. As a result, the two sides relied heavily on conscription to maintain their momentum and to bolster their war effort. The introduction of conscription was automatic in the nationalist zone, but resisted in the Republican, where obligatory military service was associated with militarism and therefore entirely with the nationalists, and which riled anarchists in particular, the militarization riled anarchists. But what's clear is that without resorting to obligatory military service, neither side would have had the manpower to conduct a 3-year-long civil war. And nevertheless, both armies struggled to retain and motivate their conscripts throughout the war. Conscripts on both sides found inventive and often desperate ways out of service that included self-mutilation, for example. Many others served grudgingly and tried to keep their heads down for the duration of the war, while others readily changed sides when it was in their interest to do so. The Spanish conflict therefore underscores the difficulty of sustained mobilization in civil war, and also reveals the number of options other than serving as conscripts that men of military age had when they were faced with their call-up papers. Now, on both sides there's ample evidence of war weariness and low commitment to political ideology. For instance, the Nationalist Army conducted a fierce campaign in 1937 against soldiers who predicted the imminent end of the war. And this example is an order given to the Nationalist 107th Division that at the time was stationed on the front just south of Madrid. And it said, "Those who propagate these rumours are enemies of nationalist Spain and agents of the Red Cause. For these reasons, any specimen from among the troops that directly or indirectly attempts to encourage war weariness or dampens the martial capability of our youth must be vigorously sought out." Similarly, in November 1937, the commissars of the 31st Mixed Brigade, that at that point was stationed the other side of Madrid, north, were ordered to, and I quote, "immediately quash any rumours of armistice or conciliation." Armistice and conciliation in the orders were capitalised. And unit commissars also had to discipline those that, and I quote, "without negative intent and by talking too much, spread their complaints, lack of discipline and discontent to the others." So conscripts on both sides suffered from loss of morale, and desertion and defection became sufficiently widespread to cause concern, although overall numbers are now difficult to fully calculate. It was the Nationalist Army, however, that was most successful in extracting a minimal level of effective service. So a minimal level of effective service from this uncommitted mass of conscripted men. This helped the Nationalist Army maintain better discipline and underpinned their steady success in the war. Now, Nationalist Army discipline was underwritten by the threat of severe punitive violence that was employed freely on soldiers who didn't conform to the new regime. But these measures alone don't fully account for the army's relationship with its soldiers. the Nationalist Army also tactically introduced a parallel system of rewards that encouraged a minimal level of effective service from its conscripts, even those with known histories of left-wing political activism or militancy. And by serving adequately in the Nationalist Army, men were able to redeem their past in the eyes of the Francoists and protect their own lives as well as those of their families. Their privileges, such as combatant subsidies and campaign pay, were also safeguarded on the same conditions. So the army therefore actively sheltered those who were prepared to contribute to the war effort. And this was stated explicitly in December 1937 by the Nationalist General Carlos Asensio Cabanillas. And he wrote, "It's necessary for unit commanders to make known to the troops, although not in an official communique, that all those who have unfavourable records are, while they serve the cause of nationalist Spain in the trenches, attenuating or erasing their guilty past." The same system was used equally effectively to create new nationalist soldiers from Popular Army deserters and prisoners of war. Thousands of former Republican conscripts were tactically coerced into donning nationalist uniforms and fought as effectively as they had done for the Republican Popular Army, a process that was informally known as recycling. And this was a feat that would have been far more difficult with the threat of reprisals alone. The nationalists' ability to ensure the participation of even recalcitrant combatants was an important advantage over the government forces and a factor in explaining their victory. Moreover, as the Nationalist Army advanced, the prospect of that nationalist Francoist victory made this system increasing, and accommodation with that victory made this system increasingly attractive. So nationalist discipline was consequently more effective, and their army successfully retained thousands of men who weren't initially loyal to their cause. And unfortunately, numbers for the entire conflict don't exist. But what we do know is that by the end of 1937, the nationalists had taken some 107,000 Republican prisoners of war. And as you can see from this graph, well over half of those were posted directly to nationalist frontline units and fought effectively, according to the nationalists' own internal reports, for their captors. So over half Republican popular prisoners of war captured by the nationalists sent directly to nationalist frontline units. And even many of those initially sent to labour camps, that's the second column here, to labour battalions, ended up fighting for the nationalists in frontline units as well. And the commander of the Nationalist Army of the North reported to Franco in January 1938 that the behaviour of these forces in these labour battalions is in general excellent. Many individuals of such battalions, guaranteed by reliable citizens, are constantly sent by the classification committees to their recruitment centres to join a combatant unit. Republican soldiers captured by the nationalists remembered that the transition from one army to the other was very quick if they were considered apolitical conscripts. For example, veteran Luis Bastida served in the Republican Army of the North and was captured by the nationalists at the end of 1937. Within a very short period of time, he was posted to the nationalist 35th Merida Regiment, serving in Galicia. And he wrote, "Even though we didn't change our ideas, in a little more than a month we had changed zone, uniform, army, songs and flags." Quite a record. Surprisingly, he was now employed by the nationalists to guard Republican prisoners of war, and he wrote ironically, "From what I see, the grey jacket and khaki trousers of our new uniforms completely bury all our pasts." Some men were recycled so fast that they didn't have time to swear an oath of allegiance to the reinstated red and yellow flag. And these figures and experiences give an indication of the fluidity between the two sides in the Civil War. So I've touched upon the similar challenges that the two armies faced with their conscription campaigns. I now want to talk about the principal differences, which were the two sides' wartime embellished narratives. So as a result of conscripts' recalcitrance, the task of motivating these soldiers was enormous, and a significant amount of energy and resources were expended in constructing and refining both sides' glorified stories designed to give the war a meaning and a purpose. And that's what I mean by embellished narrative. And to borrow a description from Mary Vincent, in the nationalist case, the mobilisation narrative turned, and I quote, a rather grubby military coup dependent for survival on foreign aid into a glorious Spanish, Catholic, military and masculine crusade. The Republic, however, faced a particularly important challenge, mobilising its conscripts, because the Popular Army was fighting a war that it was gradually losing. The conditions at the front were increasingly desperate, and by the end of the conflict, serious shortages universally prevailed. Accordingly, the Republican propaganda output, designed to offset these shortfalls, was much more voluminous than the nationalist equivalent. The two sides were also similar in that the war provided both nationalists and Republicans with an opportunity to educate the men under their control and engage in state building. In this sense, men's status as de-ideologized, as I described earlier, was not static. Indeed, there's considerable evidence for the creation of new nationalists and new Republicans from previously uncommitted men. And as a result of the brutalization of the war, its duration, and the constant ideological messages that combatants in the trenches were subjected to, this was at times successful. For example, Republican veteran Eduardo Pons Pradas referred to this explicitly in his memoirs and wrote of conscripts who became, and I quote, convinced, resolute, and in many cases determined combatants. So through their targeted educational drive, both nationalists and Republicans sought new opportunities for state authority to influence its people, even though the two sides had, of course, contrasting notions of citizenship and participation of the war, in the war. So the most important differences between the two sides were the distinctive versions of their embellished narratives. Nationalist Spain remained firmly grounded in tradition and particularly relied on the evocation of eternal Spain and the Catholic Church. Religious mobilization was successful, even though there were important and uncomfortable exceptions, in particular the Catholic and anti-revolutionary Basque nationalists that fought with the government. The Republic, in turn, created a new definition of what it meant to be a soldier, a man, and a citizen at war, and notions of appropriate masculine behaviour were modified by the Republic, distancing itself from the nationalist ultra-masculine stance. While Republican soldiers were expected to show valour and dedication, of course, they were also encouraged to be literate, educated, and politically emancipated. The two sides, however, particularly relied on an appeal to nationalism, although again, of course, with two very different and conflicting messages, to broaden and strengthen their mobilisation campaigns. For example, both sides made regular reference to the 19th century War of Independence against Napoleonic France in their propaganda. And the important differences between Republicans and nationalists lie not so much in their choice of period of history, because of course the repertoire was finite, but in their respective reinterpretation for each side's mobilising agenda. The Republic made an explicit link between the popular response to the 1936 attempted coup and the spontaneous uprising in Madrid against Napoleon's soldiers. And the following appeared in trench newspaper Presente, published by the 31st Mixed Brigade in March 1937, when it was still stationed north of Madrid. And it said, "There is only one Spain, and that Spain is our Spain, the Republican working-class Spain that rose up in July 1936, as it had done on 2nd of May 1808. The nationalists, in contrast, emphasised independence and militarism when referring to the 19th century War of Independence, as this piece of propaganda from the 107th Division shows. And that read, in the King's Square, La Plaza del Rey in Madrid, there's a statue of Infantry Lieutenant Don Francisco Ruiz Mendoza. His name is actually Jacinto, they got it wrong in this piece of propaganda, who died on 2nd of May 1808 in defence of Spain's independence. His spirit is that of all Franco's soldiers." So despite ultimately losing the war, the achievements of Republican conscript mobilisation, however, shouldn't be underestimated, and many aspects were relatively successful despite the constraints, the very obvious constraints, within which the Popular Army was forced to manoeuvre. Sufficient numbers of men responded for duty, even if not always with great enthusiasm, and allowed the government to resist the nationalist advances for almost 3 years. While the Republic was largely unsuccessful in its own military offensives, it's unreasonable to blame conscripts alone for this failure. Other factors such as strategic decisions, inexperienced junior officers, lack of equipment and poor training were also to blame. In addition, the Popular Army was tenacious in defence, and surprisingly tenacious in defence, even relatively late in the war. For example, during the slow nationalist offensive down the Levantine coast in June 1938, after the remaining Republican territory had been split in two. Given the mass mobilisation of an entire population and the added complexity of competing loyalties in civil war, this was a significant achievement. And it's within this context and with these limitations that the Republic's conscription and more broadly its mobilisation should be judged a relative success. And finally, to conclude now, despite very real differences in ideology, the Nationalist Army and the Republican Popular Army were often more similar than they superficially appeared. Both faced the serious difficulties of mobilising a proportion of the population for civil war while promoting their own values and simultaneously delegitimising the other side. The conscripted men's level of engagement with the war and their exercise of agency contributed significantly to the outcome of the conflict. It was the nationalist management of their conscripts, however, that was the more successful of the two sides. Their ability to incorporate reluctant and even former Republican recruits into their armed forces and ensure that adequate service of the majority is a vital factor in understanding their ultimate victory over the Republic. Thank you very much.